Buckle up and hands on the steering wheel. It's another Witty 924. Okay, so welcome, Max, to the show. Fantastic to have you on. And I know this has been a long time coming because I've been badgering you for many, many months to get on the show and talk about a little bit of car history. So welcome.
What can I say? Thank you. It's great to be here finally. As you say, we've taken a while to get to this point, but I'm delighted to be with you now, Al.
Awesome. So really what we'll do is we'll get into a little bit of the car history with you. I know you've got some fascinating facts, and this is why I wanted to get you on the show and just talk a lot about this. But I guess it's always good to start at the beginning, isn't it? And with that, for me, it's one question I always asked Nigel when he was on the show. But the first car, what was it, firstly? Was it the car that sort of kick-started a passion, or was it a car that sort of was just bought in to do something to get you from A to B? How did it all start?
Well, I'd have to say it's the latter. Unfortunately, it wasn't a car that many people could at that time get passionate about, though now I've noticed these things are, creating a kind of cult following. So it was a Citroen 2CV,
Oh,
bizarrely, yeah,
awesome.
which was the optimal car when I was a student to get around and about. It was the only Group One car at the time that you could sort of buy that wasn't completely impractical, and you could get four or even five grown adults in it. A lot of stuff. Take the seats out, roll the roof back. There was some kind of idea of romance, yeah. The reality, though, especially when it was cold and wet in England, was somewhat different, right? And you got water coming in through gaps in the roof lining. The windows didn't roll up or down, they just sort of unfolded, never sealed properly. And the car didn't have a lot of power, right? So getting passionate about motoring when you had, I think, precisely 32 or 33 horsepower was hard. But it had its charms. So this was a car that I, needed to get up and down to university. And I wanted something I could afford the petrol on, and the insurance and repairing it was something I could do myself. And you learn a lot about cars and driving when you have so few horsepower. Yeah. I'm sure I mean, we all started with smaller, slower cars, right?
Yeah.
But, when you've got so little power, you have to maintain every ounce of it you've got. And that means going through a roundabout, you're not picking the racing line, to enjoy the feeling of carving the corner. You're picking it because if you don't, you won't make it up the hill on the other side.
Yeah, and I remember two CVs had a great way of sort of leaning, depending on the weight and where you put people inside the car as well.
Absolutely. And that was critical, right? If you've got two mates and one of them's a little bit, more carrying a bit more timber than the other, you want to make sure he's on the right side as you're going around the corners, depending on the road. And what you would do if you were fully loaded, with a full complement of your friends going somewhere in an evening, you'd make sure as you were going round a roundabout, they'd all lean, in the right direction to counter the car's suspension. Now, that thing actually, got up and down, most hills, went round most roundabouts. And if you did get it right and you had your counterweight team with you, you could actually make reasonable pace. And I think we did surprise quite a few other drivers, when we'd go through a roundabout at, 30 or 40 miles an hour, instead of slowing down at all, with the team leaning to the right way. Yeah.
Like sidecar racing, I do fondly remember. I mean, my times with sort of a mini metro, and similar, thoughts around where you position, the teammates in the car. And with a Metro, for many of you who will know that, the suspension on those didn't have much travel, and if they started to sag, you very quickly started to ground out. But I guess with the 2CV, I think one of the highlights of them is they had amazing suspension, didn't they?
They did. It was kind of like some kind of anti-roll bar, but not only left to right, but front and rear. So
Yeah.
you could move, the car around over obstacles like speed humps. And if you took the angle of the speed hump just right, you could pretty much do the speed hump without slowing down. Yeah. It was really rewarding to get the kind of progress that you could get out of that, because you were using everything the car had. And I think that's one of the differences now, when cars have so much, power and cornering and grip, that you rarely can, use it. But there were some quirks to the car. I mean, it had a windscreen washers and wipers, which was great. It had a gear stick that came out of the dashboard, which was unusual.
Yeah.
And this particular one I had, which was bright yellow, if I remember, had its own add-ons. You know me, Al, I've always liked my technology. And the fact that you couldn't buy a 2CV with any kind of, modern security equipment or motorized, components never stopped me. So we installed central locking in this thing. It must have been the only 2CV in the world with central locking. We installed a massive stereo system, with one of those old original car stereos that had a flip up front that looked like an ashtray, some sort of plastic thing from Halfords you sort of stuck on the front of it, to make it look like it was fine. And I think obviously anyone, who heard us coming knew there wasn't just a standard radio in there. So they would have probably looked into it. And I'm sure the car got in trouble a couple of times with people breaking the window, but people couldn't work out sometimes how to open the door, because the way the handles worked inside was definitely non-standard. What else did we do? We had it was the first car I ever had sort of any kind of GPS mapping in, right? This is back in the early 90s, some sort of boat GPS unit linked to a radio receiver, then linked to one of those tiny, PDA or laptop computers, or with some sort of map on. Yeah, it was crazy what we had in those days. Yeah.
Just in case someone did manage to get it, you'd be able to see where they were.
Well, I don't think we had tracking, because I don't think there were mobile phones back then.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
This is back in the day. But yeah, it was a fun car to drive. I upgraded the exhaust, I think, a couple of times. And I do remember having to change it from spark plugs controlled by a breaker, and a commutator arrangement, to sort of electronic ignition.
That's
right?
Where it's one of the upgrades.
Put a little device in, and we put in, because it was, I think, just 2-cylinder engine, right? We put in a wasted coil device, which was just one big coil with a pin on both sides. So both spark plugs would fire at the same time. But that was perfect. And it definitely improved the running of the car, though I don't think it gave us any additional horsepower.
Yeah. So you've talked about maybe tinkering a lot with the engines, and I know they're pretty cool little engines to work on, and you have to take sort of the front part of the car away. I've seen, I think Harris and a few others have got, quite a passion for the 2CVs now, haven't they? And like you say, they have become very iconic in themselves. You talked a little bit about maybe changing the exhaust. If I remember rightly, I mean, the exhaust looked like a pea shooter. They were tiny, yeah?
It was probably about an inch or something in diameter, but it had a couple of mufflers, in various places. And back when you've got 30 horsepower, if you can liberate another 1 or 2, that's almost a 10% improvement, right? So we would do things like take off the intakes, and then you'd get to the headers, and they were like lumps of cast iron, with square and right angle bends in. And you'd do things like, try and port them, right? Which was my friend and I with a drill and some kind of sandpaper taped round a brush, you know, sort of sticking it in, trying to improve the flow. But we removed some of the mufflers. And this was, you know, what I think people are doing still to today.
Yeah.
You know, you'd get a big drill somewhere and drill holes in all the baffles to try and help the sound flow through more cleanly. But
Yeah.
I don't think it was actually, you know, really helpful, but it definitely sounded better and you felt that you'd achieved something.
Yeah. No, the good old sort of 80s and 90s with exhausts. It was fun times. So that's a great sort of start to your car history, and maybe some would argue that rather than it just being a thing that gets you from A to B, there's quite a passion there. I mean, the way you've spoken about what you did to it, how you modified it, all the cool things you did to it. I think many 2CV owners today might even think, oh, that's quite interesting. So yeah, please get in touch if you think about maybe adding some of the things that Max did to his 2CV. I guess more of a practical question then. Over your years of car ownership, what's been your most practical car that you've owned?
Yeah, I mean, look, that's a good question. I mean, I was interested in what comes next after the 2CV, right?
Yeah,
And you start looking around. If I remember back at university, none of my friends had cars that any other friend wanted, right? One guy had a Renault 4 that wouldn't start with the starter motor unless you either hammered it with some sort of sledgehammer. So he carried a lump of metal and a sledgehammer in the car to sort of hit the starter. Or we ended up just push starting it everywhere. So
yeah,
whenever he wanted to go, you know, two mates would go out, give him a push, until one point he'd got to the bottom of some hill somewhere where there wasn't anywhere to go backwards because there
oh
was a
no,
wall
yeah,
behind him
yeah,
and there was no way to push start it up the hill or something. So, you know, we definitely didn't want that car. A friend had an XR2i, which
cool,
was, you know, actually very cool at the time, though you sort of look down on it now. But around then, you know, back in the early 80s and or sort of late 80s, early 90s, that was a great fun car to nip around in. Yeah.
was
But
that
I
with
wanted
the
something.
was that with the pepper pot alloys? That's
Yes, he had the
yeah,
pepper pots.
yeah,
I think it might have been an XR2, not an XR2i,
yeah,
but he had the pepper pots. He was an amazing driver. And that's when I started to realize, you know, the car was half the equation and it was how you used it was the other half. But I do remember he was like proud of his car. And he got to the point where he'd start buying those things from Halfords, like the plastic boot tidies and things like that to keep
yeah,
everything neatly lined up. And we all made fun of him and we're like, well, hold on, how old are you? You're 19 or 20 going on 45 or something, you know, with your boot
yeah,
tidy and your special, you know, cup holder kit or something. But
yeah,
I wanted a bit of a bigger car because I'd already, you know, got this 2CV and found, you know, quite a lot of fun people in the Citroen kind of community.
yeah,
There were some independent garages down where we were based that were pretty good at helping out if you needed anything on your 2CV. And I saw other cars from them. You know, there were some small ones. Was it Saxo or something? I wasn't interested in that. But one guy had this car that they were selling, which was a Citroen BX19.
ah,
Yeah.
yes, the BX,
Now, I'm not proud of this, yeah, but I definitely wanted something more practical.
yeah,
And that had a giant hatchback. You know,
yeah,
you look like a spaceship back at the time. Our friends
was,
called it Millennium Falcon. Yeah. This was a 19 GTI. So the insurance was way up, but there was room to improve it, right? We got side skirts off the 16 valve version that someone had crashed somewhere and used Sikaflex, this horrible, incredibly gluey stuff. It's like no more nails for cars
yeah,
to stick it on. We resprayed the car. We made it even more sort of buoyed up than it was initially.
yeah,
And it ended up with an interesting story because, you know, friends started getting, you know, nicer, better cars around this time, early 20s, I guess we were. And I wanted to kind of keep up with them and, you know, started that quest, as you talked about, for more power.
yeah,
So I thought, well, okay, what do I need to do? I need to tune the car. And I did that. We put engine management kind of system on it and started to do actual sort of mapping about the limitations of what you could do in the Bosch systems I think it had then were pretty minor. But it got me interested in understanding, you know, how computers were going to have a role in cars in the future, and how if you knew, you know, how to program and talk to those computers, which most mechanics didn't, you know, you'd have an advantage. But I could see there was a better engine management system on the BX19 GTI engine, which was the same engine as used in the Peugeot, arguably much cooler. I think it was the MI16 405 or something.
That's it. Yeah.
And that was quite a beast. So I found eventually through one of these Citroen mechanic guys that someone had a Citroen BX19 16 valve, which would have been a great donor car, but the car was almost knackered. They had these weird hydroelastic suspensions, so you can
I was going to say
raise and lower them as you went. And we always thought when we were on the motorway, we'd get a few more miles an hour by dropping the ride height down to the lowest thing, imagining in some mad mind that we looked a little like a Lotus, you know, Elise or a Esprit or something. But obviously we didn't. But I bought this car from this guy, and it was stuck at High Wycombe. And I arranged, you know, 2 days later for a tow truck to go and collect this car to bring it back, and we were going to take the engine out of it, only to be very surprised. And I think this was the time where some people had mobile phones, but not many did. You know, I got a call from this guy saying, okay, Max, I'm here. I'm where the car's meant to be. You know, I can't see any car. And we're trying to explain where he was. I had to find a phone booth and call him back or whatever. And I'm trying to put your 10p's or 20p's in that you did back in the day. And I'm like, this can't be right. And we spent some time on with him, eventually getting the guy who had sold us the car involved. And he was like, no, that's where the car was left, right? And then the guy said, look, I found a police, one of those reported missing or, you know, fixed notices, you know, police aware stickers kind of things. I found one of those just on the side here. So it's clearly the right place, but the car's gone. And we're like, what on earth? So we reported it stolen. You know, then they're like, well, who owns the car? And I'm like, well, I've just bought it. Well, who have you got the V5? Well, I haven't got that yet or anything. And it looked really dodgy. And we're thinking this is a write-off. Anyway, quite aggrieved by the whole thing until 3 weeks later, a friend of mine calls up and he goes, Max, your Citroen. Yeah. Where was it? I said, High Wycombe. He goes, I found it. I'm like, what are you talking about? And he's done his amateur detective sleuthing.
Yeah.
And he's looked on the Auto Trader or whatever in the parts section. And he's found someone who's parting out a Citroen BX 16 valve. There was only one. There can't have been many of them around anyway. And he checked and called the guy and asked for the VIN numbers. The guy was, you know, suspicious, but he said it was he needed to find the right age engine to fit in his car. The guy gave him the last 4 digits or something, which happened to match the one I'd lost. Wow. So then we knew where the car was. We got the police to turn up at the guy's site with the tow truck guy, recover the vehicle. You know, he recovered a bunch of other parts as well, which we didn't need. And eventually we got this engine back. So
wow.
At that point, I'm like, right, I've really, you know, done a lot of unnecessary work. Now, how do we fix it? And we tuned up all of the engine. We got it all properly ported this time. We got the engine management working. We rebuilt it with better cylinders, liners, improved the camshafts and things. I think we got Gen V throttle bodies at the time, were quite a unique thing. And the plan was to set it up as a independent throttle body, individually controlled, computerized 16 valve. Did a lot of work, but this had taken, you know, about a year and a half by then, you know, to the point where I'd moved on. So the car, you know, our BX, my BX, never got its transplanted engine. And eventually I sold the engine to some guy who was putting it into a Peugeot 205.
Wow.
You know, which was kind of like a funny shell because it was like really, you know, rusty and looked old, but everything inside had been done incredibly. Rose jointed suspensions,
Wow.
billet engineering,
Yeah.
CNC kind of mounts on the roll cage, no expense spared.
Yeah.
And he put this engine in, and I thought, this is crazy. He's got the most incredibly performant engine you could fit in a 205.
Yeah.
He's building it into this car that he's, totally sorted the suspension on and everything. But it looks like a POS, right?
Sounds like a sleeper.
And this was it. And
Yeah.
he said, yeah, I could polish it all and everything else, but then it's just a 205. But if it's, if it looks like this,
Yeah.
and then goes past some far more expensive, far more premium looking metal, yeah, there is no feeling like it when you've just gone past someone's BMW or something in a rusty looking 205. Yeah. And I realized that was it. And of course, obviously, since then, you've seen the rat rods and all of these things have become a thing.
Well, yeah,
which
indeed, and we'll get on to that. And I just want that last bit on the BX because it's a fascinating story. I mean, not only the detective work, but finding the car back in the 80s. I mean, all sorts of stuff went on with cars and trying to find anything that might have been cut and shut. And I mean, you were sort of needle in haystack type scenarios, weren't you? But if I remember rightly, the BX wasn't it mostly plastic, like the panels and the bonnet and so
no,
on?
you're right. It was fiberglass. The boot panels and things were fiberglass. And I found that to my cost when I installed a bike carrier, one of those early ones that sort of went on the rear window on the back. Put my bike on the back of it, put my friend's bike on the back of it. I think, they weren't carbon or anything like that, like they are today. So they were probably quite heavy, each of them, steel mountain bike type things. And the rear window popped out and the sort of thing went through. So I don't know. I don't think all the boot was like that, but some bits of it were.
Yeah.
So I really, you really had to be careful. But the side skirts were sort of not carbon. They were all fiberglass.
Yeah.
And lots of the parts, like the bumper at the front, was plastic.
Yeah.
Now back then, you didn't have those plastic staples, to heat things up and fix it. So you were trying to put Bondo and fiberglass and filler on the back, which of course, as it was all flapping around at any kind of speed, degraded. And I remember seeing a friend's one that he used for racing, sort of the front bumper came off, or part of it, the lip spoiler or something, as he was driving along, and he ran over his own bumper as he's driving along. So you had to be careful. But yeah, they were fun cars. They were pretty practical. They were quite comfortable if you didn't kind of lower them and pump the suspension up too much. And definitely unique cars for the time.
Indeed. I mean, my vivid memories of sort of Citroen of old is the suspensions were way ahead of their time compared to everyone else. I mean, they were always sort of experimenting, and obviously they're still widely used in horse racing because of how soft and supple and smooth they are as a suspension setup. So, and I just remember many Citroens looking faded because of, like you say, the fiberglass, the paint, they decolored or discolored very quickly, didn't they, over the years? So no, it's a fabulous story there about that BX, and very practical. So moving on to...
Well, I'm just remembering there was one thing that wasn't good about the car. Now you've just reminded me. As I said, we'd repainted it, and really nice two-pack paint that my friend had applied, so it did look beautiful. And this was back in the days when, I don't know if it was Max Power or something was coming out and car meets. So we had full neon on this thing. We had neon underneath, we had neon round the subwoofer, and the neon was brilliant unless it was raining. And if it was wet enough, the neons, I think, generated a high voltage to energize the tubes. But somehow the combination of the fiberglass parts that weren't properly earthed or insulated, the high voltage in the neon, and the way we'd wired the whole thing up, if you touched any metal part of the car, like the wheels in the wet, you'd get a nasty shock. So you had to be careful when getting out of the car as well. I just remember that.
Well,
definitely.
that's a car burglar's nightmare there if you touch any
Yeah,
metal.
I'd put it down to security, but no, it was just
Exactly, exactly.
poor wiring, so not something I'm proud of.
So going on from practicality and obviously some fantastic customizations there. What's your fastest car that you've ever owned?
So the fastest car I've ever owned is a Honda NSX.
Okay.
So I had a few cars, and I'd always thought, what I needed was more power, more power.
Okay.
But
Sound like
what
Jeremy
you
Clarkson.
yeah, exactly. Because that's what it was, isn't it? Especially if you're into technology and you look at, the engineering of things,
Yeah,
to make something go faster, you're tempted to just make it more powerful, right?
yeah,
That's
yeah,
that's your schoolboy kind of thinking. But as you realize, after a while, we did a lot of track days and things like that. It
yeah,
was rarely the most powerful car that was the fastest, especially if there's any kind of cornering involved or anything else. Yes, in a
yeah,
straight line, if you've got
yeah,
enough power, you'd probably be the quickest, right? But you get to diminishing returns with that. And I'd realized, about this point that I needed something, that wasn't just more powerful, but it was about power to weight.
yeah.
So I looked around and I looked at all of the kind of options that were available for me. And I was thinking, okay, now's the time. I think I was in my early 30s or something. I was thinking, okay, I want to get something nice. I was working at Sony, and I had a friend who, knew some of the Japanese people at Sony.
Yeah.
And it turned out there was an opportunity to get hold of a Honda NSX.
Wow. And this
And
is
I looked,
this is the original one, yeah?
yes, yes. So this car was, I think, a 1994. So it's got the pop up headlights.
Nice.
It's the 3.2 liter, not the 3 liter, I think. So it's the slightly larger engine,
Yeah.
manual car.
Wow.
And as a Japanese import, it had ABS braking, it had power steering, and it had traction control. But in Japan, there was a big thing about ABS and traction and things like that. So they pretty much had a way where pretty much any sports car, you could turn these things off. I guess
Oh,
for
okay.
drifting and things like that
Of
became
course.
popular over there. You don't want those aids, helping or interfering
Yeah.
when you're trying to, execute a J turn round a concrete pillar in a car park coming in at the wrong time.
Yeah.
So there was a system that you could hold down a button or do something, and it disabled all of those things, which made it a very raw driving experience.
Yeah.
But I looked for something which had that power to weight ratio, which I felt with my medium driving skills would give me an advantage on the track in
Yeah.
a way that more power or more weight probably wouldn't. And I looked at the time, between the NSX and one other car, yeah, to decide what what to get. And I kind of, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I wish I'd made a different decision
Yeah.
now, but in hindsight, it would have been a more financially attractive decision. But there were two cars that this decision came down to. One was a BMW Z8,
Okay. Yeah.
and one was the NSX. Yeah, and it was more power in the Z8 because it had that amazing V8
Yeah.
engine,
Yeah.
but it was a heavier car. And I think I did the calculations based on, the numbers I could find at the time. And, various NSXs were slightly different in terms of weight. But the Z8s, the published figures from BMW, I think were different. They might have had a driver in, when
Yeah.
the Honda's figures hadn't or something. And it ended up where the BMW Z8 was around 37K, something like that. The NSX was about 34K, something like that.
I mean,
So,
those
you know,
prices.
not a lot. Well, it was a lot
Yeah.
of money back
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
day, but now, if you think about it, the extra 3K wouldn't have made a big
Yeah.
difference, right? But the resale prices now, although both have appreciated,
They
which is
have.
fantastic, they're beautiful cars. If you'd had one of those early Z8s, yeah, you would be sitting on a gold mine right now. And I decided to pick the NSX because the power to rate ratio I worked out was better. and absolutely loved it. V6 rev to sort of 9,000 RPM. We did track days in it, and I burnt through lots of brakes and tires and things, having an amazing time.
Yeah, and they're quite different cars. I mean, the NSX. I mean, you'll know the story better than me, but I remember it ruffled a lot of feathers amongst the sort of sports elite brands as well. I know Ferrari were ruffled by it, Porsche were ruffled by it. So it was such a, new way of looking at how a sports car could operate, not just from the looks, but functionally, from the driving experience, which I think, Honda hit the nail on the head. You could argue really the BMW is a nice cruising car to look at, and obviously became potentially more more iconic because of the James Bond connection and all of those good things. But both, as you say, today are iconic in their own right, aren't they?
I think you're spot on, Al. Both of them are amazing driving experiences, and I think what was a key takeaway from me is that it helped me up my game again, learning how to handle and manage that car. Really improved my appreciation for racing and for the skills that the development teams, the engineering teams,
Yeah.
and the drivers actually have. Because I remember seeing the original early clips of Senna, driving the
Of course.
NSX
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
test it out for the Honda team, and how his times round the laps, I think it was Suzuka or somewhere that he was driving around, compared to almost anybody else's laps. He was making that car dance in a way no one else could.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I thought that that was just him, or the car wasn't a typical representative car, some sort of thing with extra power or something different about it. But I went on one of these car control days once, where you learn about how to use your car's momentum and how to position it
Yeah.
and how to brake properly. And it was the first time that it was really educating me about how that weight transfer affects how you apex and how you move in and out of a corner. And the guy teaching it was an incredible driver. He was a ex-rally professional, raced alongside McRae and things like that.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day's sessions, I think it was 2 days, we'd been out in the cars that they had there, which were BMWs and Porsches. And then we went out back to the car park sort of area, and he said, "Oh, this is your car." And the other guy who was on the course with me, he had a nice car as well. He said, "Oh, both beautiful cars." And the other guy said, "Oh yeah, do you want to drive his car?" And this rally driver said, no, it's all right. He was familiar with them as well, but he looked very expectantly at me. And I sort of looked and I said, "Well, would you like to drive mine?" He goes, "I'd love to. I've never driven one before." Yeah. And I'm like, "Well, okay, what's the worst that could happen?" Well, he could write it off or something. But he took me out in my car around the same course we'd been out in these other cars earlier. And he just made me realize how much of a gap there was between my skills,
Yeah.
and someone that can really,
Yeah.
truly, use all of the performance in the car. And, he was braking so much faster and quicker than I could ever imagine.
Yeah.
Back on the power and just making this car dance. And he said, "Oh, I absolutely love this car," when he sort of handed it back to me. And I was just grinning from ear to ear for a while afterwards. But that was a beautiful car. I think it's meant to do 179, 180,
Yeah.
something like that. I had it up into the 170s at one point. That's the fastest I've ever been
Wow.
in it.
Okay.
But I decided to try and film the speedo at the time, and when I realized I was holding a camera one-handed trying to look at the speedo, I thought this is probably not a good idea, and stopped. And I've never approached VMAX in it since.
So that is the fastest car, and I guess the final bit on that, did you ever feel the need to maybe add a bit of upgrades? You seem to have done that with a lot of your cars. Is that something you ever tinkered with?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't think any car is so precious if you're going to drive it, right? If
Yeah.
you're going to use that car and get the most out of it, then you want to feel, that car, under you, and you want to enjoy it for what it is. And what it is isn't just what it is on the day it left the factory,
Yeah.
but it's what it can be with the right, with the right work, with the right mods. Just like changing tires can make a massive difference. And, we know our continental friends change summer and winter tires that not everyone does over here,
Yeah.
but that makes sense. And one of the things that Honda had done is they'd continuously improved the car over its life, to the point where the newer cars, the 2000 onwards cars that had the faired in lights, also had an improved braking system with much bigger brakes at the front and rear, slightly different valves, to affect the distribution. And that was an improved system, right? So what I did to my NSX is I replaced the brakes that were the original ones with the newer but factory Honda ones off the later series of cars, which really improved it. Or any fade, even after continuous stops on a track, went away. Just that feeling of confidence improved. And the guy that I bought the calipers and everything from, he had gone one step further and put in a set of massive AP racings, in under his NSX, because he was tracking it every weekend. He was using that car as a, real race car every day. And I think those kind of improvements, as long as they're done sympathetically, are brilliant for the car and brilliant for the driver, right? And I would never say you shouldn't do that unless it's something, that's historically important.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, Matt, so we've spoken a lot about the fastest car, and the NSX is truly iconic in every sense. And you're touching on the realms of 180 is pretty cool, even if you are doing it one-handed with your own camera in situ, which is pretty brave. But this one,
it's stupid, more like you don't always think how sensible these things are at the time, do you?
I know. So here's a good question that I really wanted to dig into, because our time talking a little bit at Le Mans together is sort of unpack this, which I hadn't realized before, but very interesting. What's the most outrageous car that you have owned or been part ownership with, and what's the?
Well, look, I think they're probably not that I've owned, but that I've been involved with or worked on or helped with, right? If we expand it to that, there's some interesting things. I mean, I mentioned that I had a relationship with Citroen for a while. I had a few Citroens.
Yeah.
I even had a Citroen SM at one point, which was very weird. But I won't mention that anymore. But I also had a good relationship with VW. And, like a lot of guys, as you're growing up, you look around and you see these different cars that are out there.
Yeah.
And, a friend had a Mini. That was one of the first cars that I drove in, a friend's Mini. I'd learned to drive in his Mini when he wasn't using it, that kind of thing. It was great, the small original one. And we've had, since then, I've had a new Mini, a little Cooper S, which is brilliant for nipping around in. But VW was one of those things that you looked at and it was sort of a lot better, a lot more solid, than the similar cars. Renault 5 was great, but like a tin box. Peugeots were fun as well to drive. And when we were kids, we couldn't afford, BMWs, Mercedes, anything top tier. So you looked at VW, and I had a friend, with a Polo, which I didn't like. I had a friend with a Passat, which was big and clunky. But I had a couple of friends with Golf.
Okay.
And that was brilliant car, right? VW Golf. There was something cool about it. Everyone remembers the advert. It was almost aspirational. But they were available if you bought an old Golf. They were available. You could work on them and you could do stuff with them. That was great. And getting into VW Golf is you started to realize, it was almost a lifestyle thing. All the Golf drivers would go around like waving at each other. Then you were sort of attached to the brand. So VW, Beastie Boys popped up with their big badges and things. And you thought, okay, this is interesting. And it got us interested in the history of VW. and VW campers. We knew someone with one of them, though we never had one ourselves. But Beetles, VW Beetles,
Yeah, yeah,
really fun and cool at the time, right? So this is after the 60s and 70s, when you'd buy a Beetle new as a car to use. And I don't think we knew anyone who had bought a new Beetle to have as a car. But you could buy, as a late teenager, you could buy an old VW Beetle, work on it, fix up what needed doing, and then you had a great car to drive around with, which
yeah.
was part of a scene. And you'd go down to Cornwall and do some surfing in it and things like that.
That's
But
it.
of course, as you heard, I'm interested in technology and things. So I'm like, well, we've got this Beetle, how do we improve it? And a lot of the UK Beetles were a bit rusty.
Yeah.
And they didn't last well. You get some salt on the roads.
Oh,
I guess
yeah.
they didn't have as much of that in Germany, and it would eat through everything. So you'd think, well, if I'm going to improve this car, what can I do? And the first thing you can do is put things like washer motors in it, windscreen wiper motors and windscreen washer motors, because the very early Beetles, I don't know if you know, Al, their way of squirting the washer fluid onto the window was by having a rubber pipe connected to the front spare tire. And
Oh,
Beetles
okay. Yeah, yeah.
in the bonnet there. And then you plug this pipe onto the valve of your spare tire,
Yeah.
and the pressure in the tire squirts the water out when you press the button.
That's crazy.
It's great. But if
Yeah.
you use it a bit too much and then you have a puncture, you've got a flat front tire, which is really a sensible thing.
Oh,
So
it's funny.
we do simple stuff like add those kind of functions into a car, something that you kind of needed,
Yeah, yeah.
or we felt you needed. And then we got interested in the engine. Now, the difference between the 2CV engine and the Beetle engine is that you've got more cylinders, right? And you've got more larger cylinders, you've got more capacity. So if you get it right, you can make a much more powerful engine.
Yeah.
And people were making these engines and tuning them up, to quite significant, power outputs. You could get a 2-liter engine, and there were guys, I think it was Gene Berg and others, that would make a really well running engine. It wouldn't be particularly efficient, but you'd have the capability there to generate good power, and then you could do races and things. Now, Beetles weren't exactly the best, apart from Herbie racing around a track, but they were brilliant with enough power going in a straight line. And that's where we started getting interested. Like, if you got this Beetle and you got this powerful engine, how fast could it go, right?
Yeah,
and we found that there were loads of other people with the same ideas, and they would start to compete against each other. And eventually, you'd find hundreds of these people would turn up at Santa Pod, for
yeah.
Volksfest, or Run What You Brung Day, Bug Jam, and you'd have these kind of drag races with other Beetles. Now, most of the time, someone's car would break, and then you'd win by default. But you would find that over the course of a bunch of years, people's speeds and times were starting to get better and better.
Yeah.
And some of these Beetles started to approach, really amazing times, the kind of times that sort of dragsters or really powerful performance cars were achieving, because you were designing the car for that, mainly for that purpose of racing on that track, just for that quarter mile.
Yeah.
And I found that really interesting. It was a battle of you against the mechanics, of the machine,
Yeah.
and the conditions at the time. Because you could make the most incredible car, but if there was any oil or wetness on the track, you wouldn't grip.
Yeah.
If the temperature was too hot, you'd overheat. If it was too cold, you'd get something frozen up or something.
Yeah.
And you tried to make this car able to win the competition, to win that quarter mile race, that drag, but not too reliable. So you beefed up all the components and everything, so it was super bulletproof, because then it would be heavier than the guy next to you who had wired it up with a bit of coat hanger and chicken wire or something. And you try to get that balance right. Now, about this time, a really good friend of mine started bringing Beetles over from the US, because back to that point, you wanted a shell that could take the power, and therefore you didn't want it to have massive rust holes in. And he would bring parts over from the US, and then he would buy a few cars and engines. And a friend of ours who was a pilot would go over to the US, get a catalog of cars being sold in California, bring it back. We'd mark the ones we wanted, what we wanted to pay for it. And then they'd go over and buy a few of these cars, put it in container, and a few months later, you know, these things, maybe 6 months later, would turn up at the docks, and you'd go and collect these things. And what we found is that by bringing a car back, a VW Beetle with its engine in, you'd pay some sort of taxes and things. But bringing a VW shell back and then a separate engine, I think it was actually better, because it was considered car parts and parts, not a running car. So the taxes and duties were different. But by buying these things, you've got great condition, you've got access to parts without the massive premium they were charging, you know, in the UK. And you could then do the work to build these things up. And in doing that, you'd make, you know, a pretty powerful car that would be at a reasonable price, you know, compared to what you'd have to pay to buy that car fully built in the UK, or make it yourself with all the components. And we got quite competitive, right? You know, we were targeting sort of 12 seconds, something like that, for a quarter mile.
And what sort of speed, just for the listeners, what sort of speed does that entail? You know, a quarter mile, 12 seconds.
I think a 12-second quarter mile is probably around 120 trap speed, something like that. I think the thing that you found is that you got, you know, reaction times and things like that you have to build into it. You've got a lot of complexity in the sort of the launch, because this is way before traction control or anything like that. And you're therefore in almost always a manual car, unlike our colleagues in the US who had just massive, you know, automatic boxes. So you're trying to lock the front wheels with some kind of brake and line lock arrangement, where you hold down the brakes, lock up the fronts, take the pressure off the brake so that the rears can spin, and then get a burnout going on the rear to heat up the tires. And you've got to do all that and then launch, managing the gearbox, which weren't brilliant in the VW, and the engine power and the revs, you know. So it was educational, but it was a great set of challenges. And, you know, people would start to improve their ability to change at the right time by putting shift lights in. And that was the first time you started seeing those bolt-on kind of bright red lights, either in the middle steering wheel or on the side of the A pillar, and you'd get it really to shine right into whoever was driving's eye, so that they couldn't fail to realize they were about to grenade the engine and change. And as these cars got faster and faster, the time started to improve. You know, you'd get 1 or 2 runs on a day, on a track day, where you'd get 11:55 or something like that, and you'd be like, wow, we've broken 12, well, where do we go next? And then it'd be like, well, can we get into the 10s? There's this whole thing about 10-second quarter mile isn't you've beaten 10 seconds, it's that it's your 10.599999. Like, you just weren't starting with an 11, right? And that was like, you'd break into the 10s and you'd think, right, well, can we get sub 10-second? Now that was starting to get seriously fast. I don't think many cars around at the time, you know, Ferraris, Porsches, things like that, would have easily broken that 10-second, because they didn't have the traction. Or if they did have the traction and massive tires and things, they had then a massive engine to sort of spool up that drivetrain, and then they'd be heavy, and they'd be in that kind of battle. So this was that combination that we talked about earlier about power to weight. You needed the absolute best power to weight. You needed a light chassis, a light shell. So people started replacing the parts of their Beetle shell with fiberglass, you know, and really did replace the whole shell in some cases. You'd want to have the minimum components you needed to do those 3 or 4 runs at a time. So you'd remove some of the cooling components so that if it overheated, you weren't carrying the weight of all that water.
Yeah.
You could only do 3 runs before it did overheat. So you try and balance that. And we got to the point where there were people that were taking this seriously. They'd rebuild their gearbox before almost every race, to put new cogs in, and you'd then try and harden the cogs, but drill out different parts of the car's rotating components so it was light. You weren't looking for maximum power. You needed that responsiveness. And of course, as things got better and better, like Colin Chapman said, you add lightness. You want it to be lighter. And how do you make an engine lighter? Well, you don't really. And as I said, they had carburetors which were quite big and heavy and complicated to tune. And one way you can improve the engine is you can improve the way you get the fuel into the engine to get more fuel in faster, which means injection. And you can then replace quite a lot of weight from the kind of the air intakes, and then the carbs, and then the equipment you needed to, because you had dual carbs when you wanted to get that much fuel into the engine. Quite a lot of complicated linkages between, that was all complicated. And clearly wires are lighter and cheaper, and you can replace a lot of it with a few injectors. And then you started to use things like MSD coil ignition systems to fire the coils, which means that you could get a very reliable spark and improve the timing, so you weren't running too lean, and damaging your engine. And then you could try and improve your performance still further, turbocharging and things like that weren't so common, supercharging. But there was one other way that people started to look at as a great way to get that performance, keep the engine light, but put a load more power in without adding a lot of weight, and that was nitrous oxide. So as they say in Fast and the Furious, NARS. But it was the first time that I'd really seen people using this. And what people would do would turn up with a tank of nitrous, some sort of braided hose, taking it to effectively, like a carburetor jet inside the carbs, and they'd drill a hole in the air intake or in the plenum and stick this jet in, and at the full wide open throttle they'd trigger a little solenoid valve that squirted the nitrous in. And the first guy we ever saw doing this, he did one run and then blew up his engine. He didn't even have a solenoid. He literally had the tap on the nitrous bottle. He had the bottle next to him. So while he's trying to time his takeoff and get the gear changes right and get the revs right and everything else, he's trying with one hand to steer the car and the other hand to undo a tank valve on the nitrous tank to let the whole thing in, which all then just blasted in and blew up everything, right? So after they cleaned off his oil and bits of engine from the track and it's somebody else's turn, everyone laughed. But I remember thinking, the time that he did that 0 to 30, that launch, that first to second gear change was about maybe a third faster or even half the time that anyone else was doing it. And though he didn't make, a good trap speed with a blown engine, you could see there was something in it, right? And there was something there. And people started to look at how do they improve, that performance you get from nitrous, but also how do they get the reliability? And it was clear that doing it with a one shot valve coming in on wide open throttle was a pretty much hit or miss approach. And people started realizing, well, when we squirt a whole load of nitrous into the engine, how do we control the pressure of the nitrous? So the first thing people did was put some pressure regulator on the nitrous, so that when the tank was full, you get a certain level of pressure. And then when the tank's empty, your pressure in the tank's different. you don't want the performance to be wildly different, because then you have to treat the car differently, and
Exactly.
no one knows that, and whoever's driving at that time's got no chance, and it all goes wrong. So they made it the pressure consistent, and then they said, well, how do we always make sure we're operating at a good pressure? And somebody else worked out, well, let's heat up the nitrous tank so that we've got a really hot tank. And in the early days,
Sounds
someone would be there before
scary.
you took off with a blowtorch,
Oh my God.
literally heating up the tank, right? Which is does sounds
Wow.
a bit crazy, but
It does.
license for disaster there, until people worked out, well, we can get these electrical pads that go
Yeah.
round the tank and warm it, and you've got a consistent temperature with a regulator on. But when that happened, it was obvious that technology has a place to play
Yeah.
in this. And by controlling the temperature of the tank with a thermostat,
Yeah.
you could get some consistency. And then having a pressure regulator, could give you some consistency. But what it didn't do was help you manage when that nitrous came in, the difference between it being on or off.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there were two parts to that. First of all, if the nitrous came in when you didn't have enough fuel going into the engine, you were screwed, right? It was going to run super lean. You'd get knocking. You'd burn through your valves,
Yeah.
in no time, and it wasn't going to last very long. Or if it went in, after you had too much fuel, didn't have as much of an effect. So there was only one sort of point in the rev range where you really wanted your nitrous to come in, and you really wanted it to be different, whether you were low down in the rev range or high up in the rev range.
Yeah.
That wasn't easy. So what people started doing is saying, okay, well, let's squirt more fuel in when we squirt the nitrous in. And therefore they'd set up the same switch on wide open throttle to not only trigger extra fuel as well as the nitrous, but to sort of fire these two things at the same time. And then by adjusting screws and grub screws on where on the linkage these things would start pressing the trigger, they could try and feed in the fuel a little bit before they squirted in the nitrous and things. But it was still pretty much pot luck. It was like roulette with your engine, whether it
Sounds crazy.
yeah. So that raises the question, well, how do you do that properly? And it was about that time, I think I was studying electronics, or I was learning about electronics and things, and I started hearing about the difference between AM radio, which, remember, everyone had back in the day. They were pretty simple. And then people started talking about FM radio, frequency modulated radio, right? And it sounded better, that's clear, but how did it work, right? Well, I don't think many people would know, and no one needs to know now because we're all on DAB or digital. But it was about the way you could control, a voltage, which gives you your music, gives you your audio. And that, helped me create an interest in audio all my life, which I've had, from pulsing, a particular frequency, right? And it was clear that, you could use this for a lot of things. I mean, everyone's seen radio controlled cars with their servo motors. How do you tell the servo motor where to open to? And that's used in cars today, on all the valves, on the air intakes and everything, for your heating, climate control, for your heater at home. And if you pulse something slower, you get a little bit of nitrous pumping in with every pulse. And you pulse it faster, you'll get more nitrous coming in. And over time, it meant that you could actually start to control the amount of nitrous as you needed it, right? And that exactly is the same as how a modern air fuel ratio is calculated, right? And the injectors aren't either on or off. It's not just pumping, fuel in through a valve. It's actually pulsing the injectors differently depending on how much fuel you need, to the point now where they're incredibly precise. And that's why people match their injectors to make sure they're putting the right amount of fuel into each cylinder. And this was, before that. But by pulsing the nitrous solenoid that was on the bottle after the pressure regulator, you could control feeding in the nitrous in a much more managed way. And this is what we started to do with these cars, whereby you'd work out that if I got to this RPM, 2000 RPM, 3000 RPM, I'd
Yeah.
start to feed the nitrous in and a bit of extra fuel. You get to 4000 RPM, and these things didn't rev anything like, to the way cars did
Yeah.
today. They'd
Yeah.
just blow up if you went over 6, I think. But you get to 4000, you'd be then feeding in 50% of nitrous, and at 5000 RPM, you'd be feeding as much nitrous in as you could. And this is where it became progressive, right? And you started to be able to control that delivery of the extra power to the point where you could drive these things in a way that made you allow that thought about traction and gear and where am I, rather than that kind of Mad Max hit the button and NAS and just boost and hope you make it to the end. And this really worked well. And the car that we were using to do this, called Freddy's Nightmare, I think it was called, or Freddy's Revenge, which was a beautiful Beetle that had been built specifically for drag racing.
Yeah.
Lots of the weak points had been fixed. The suspension had been improved. We'd blown up the differential loads of times, so they welded it to create a spool.
Yeah.
So this thing couldn't turn corners, but it could go in a straight line incredibly fast. And it was the first time sort of seeing the nitrous on that, and then thinking about this, made me, appreciate what's coming. And then recently, or not recently, but after that, I saw people starting to sell nitrous kits built the same way, in the open market.
Yeah.
To high performance car drivers, your BMWs, your Porsches, things like that. And there was a company, I don't know if they're still going, called Trevor Langford, who actually created these adverts in the magazines. They were calling themselves the Wizards of Noz instead of Wizards of Oz. And they created a similar progressive nitrous kit, but it was installed on some crazy cars, massive Range Rovers and things like that weren't your choice for drag racing. And of course, now when you look at a lot of the JDM tuning and things, and a lot of the things like we see in Fast to the Furious, the nitrous is even controlled by the car's ECU. So it's able to feed it in, look at the air fuel ratio coming out of the O2 sensors, and then adjust it in real time on each run, depending on the temperature, the altitude, and all of the other conditions.
Amazing.
That controls how much oxygen is going into the engine. And this is where we've got to today. And it's absolutely amazing to see that kind of level of progress.
Yeah. And it's all, like you say, down to technology. But what a story. I mean, I mean, for me, in all really, of just listening to what was the scene of Santa Pod back in the day with Beetles, and how, as you say, it's sort of progressed across all types of sort of racing series at Santa Pod now. And, it's fascinating to hear those sort of first steps you were taking with just a mere Beetle, who many will say was also the starting place for Porsche. But anyway,
I think you're right. Look at the 914s and things. I think that was a joint relationship with VW and Porsche. And the funny thing is, right, those early Beetles, 1970s Beetles, their top speed was 80 miles an hour, right? If you went to 90 or 100, you were in something incredible. But VW, they took that Beetle, that newer version they made, what was it called? The LSR.
Yeah.
I think they took that over 200 miles an hour, right? And that shows how much progress
it's crazy.
has happened. But you're right, Beetles, I think, became the start of that accessible car, and definitely for me became the first car which had accessible real performance if you could build it and tweak it and fettle it. And I love that. Very, very good memories.
Very, very cool. Very cool. Thank you so much for that sort of insight. And I guess this leads us on to sort of the final questions now, which is, if you think about your history and everything you've gone through, and you look at sort of the modern car world today, is there any particular car that you've always wanted to own, both, past and present, that might be catching your eye?
Well, there's some amazing cars, a Mercedes 300 SL Gold. Yeah, that would be nice, but I think it's kind of outside most mortals' budgets, right? the car that I absolutely loved when it came out. In fact, I bought the big coffee table book on it, the whole history of it, right? Was the McLaren F1. You
Oh,
know,
of
what
course.
a game changer
Yeah.
that car was. But again, I made an inquiry. You know, I'd done okay, lots of things had gone well a number of years ago. And I made an inquiry when someone was advertising one. And of course, they didn't put the price, they put POA. And this was, I don't know, I think this was around 15, 20 years ago, maybe
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, you know, maybe it would be around 100, 150K, something like that. It turned out it was closer to 200K, right?
Wow.
At the time, this car was going for maybe 210, 220.
Yeah.
And the guy on the other end was like wanting to weed out, you know, who was serious. He goes, well, what do you think is worth? What are you talking about, you know, for this kind of car? I'm sure you appreciate, Mr.
Yeah.
how unique and special and valuable this car is. And I said, well, I was thinking around 100, 150. He goes, well, I think you say something like close but no cigar or something cheesy. Yeah. And it was like, it's a little bit more than that, you know, just under double. So that's what I remember take away. But it, you know, if you'd bought that car for
Oh,
200K,
yeah.
you know, and now look at what they're worth, you know, that would have been another impressive purchase. But there was a great story about Gordon Murray. He'd set this golden rules of the McLaren F1's design and written this up in McLaren HQ about what the targets were for
Yeah.
all of it. And I think it was meant to be, you know, something like 1,000 kilos, the weight,
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly. And they'd tried everything. They'd gone for, you know, all of the lightning that they could, the gold foil, you
Yeah.
know, Iconol exhaust systems, everything on that car was incredible. But they got to a point where they realized there was one thing they weren't going to make. And the rumor is, and it's mentioned in this book, that one night late after everyone else had gone, he sneaked back into the McLaren headquarters. And where he had written 1,000 kilo target weight, he quietly crossed that out, wrote 1,004 kilos, which was what they got to because he used steel brakes or something at the time. The ceramic brakes
Yeah.
weren't reliable enough or something, and that was the lowest they could get to
Yeah.
using those steel brakes, right? So he changed the rules, you know, and I think that was the interesting thing about what he did. I'd always loved Maseratis. The old Maseratis
Yes.
I thought
Oh,
were
very cool.
incredibly beautiful. Doesn't have the same, you know, excessive connotations as some companies. It's a bit more discreet, but
Yeah.
there were some beautiful Maseratis, you know, in the history of that mark. And though, you know, they depreciate, as we know, fairly scarily, I think they can still make some of the most beautiful cars. Um, and I think, you know, that's probably one of the cars that I'd always wanted, you know,
Yeah.
something beautiful, something Italian, you know, with an incredible design that's sort of timeless, but is also very, very fun or enjoyable to drive.
And it's interesting because maybe people don't know this. You tend to think about the iconic brands of Ferrari, Porsche, Mercedes, and so on about like their age, but Maserati's like what I think it's like 108 years old or something crazy. It's like older than most of the big companies out there and has history that many would fight for it, and of course there's been some lumps and bumps throughout its lifetime like many of the big brands go through. But yeah, it's so iconic, and I, personally, I like the fact that the brand itself seems to have found its fitting again. It's found its mojo, which is great. So yeah, I hear you on the Maserati piece, and I guess well, the final question to close off this fantastic session together would be, what is your favorite car brand? Not just the car you want to own, but what is the favorite brand that's always sort of had a soft spot in your heart?
Well, look, that's an interesting one. I've talked about, you know, my affinity for
Yeah.
Citroens and VWs in the early days. And, you know, there's been an incredible appreciation for, you know, the engineering that Honda brought to the car world, right? If you look at so many of the the breakthroughs, variable valve timing, and other things that Honda did. And they changed the game, as you said, with the NSX, making it a usable, practical sports car that you could, run and go to and from work in every day, which I did for years and years. And that's an incredible brand. But it wouldn't be a conversation between you and I, Al, if it wasn't a little bit controversial. Yeah. So this is where, the things I say next probably aren't going to, resonate with yourself and many of our friends. Yeah. Because I would say the brand that I feel, are pushing the boundaries, right, of what's possible, now and in the future from motoring, from cars, is a brand that not everyone's going to love, right? I've loved, incredible engineering in the engines that we've talked about, a beautiful V8 or a flat crank V6, something, immortal about the sound those things make. And this thing's not going to make the same kind of sound. Yeah. But if I look at a brand that's changing the game, that's not settling, for any of the status quo, and I think is going to make something, truly game changing, for us and our kids and the future. Unfortunately, it has to be Tesla. Yeah? But let's look at where they started, right? So the original Tesla Roadster was made from an incredible joint venture with Lotus.
Yeah, indeed.
Where the original Lotus body was for the Elise was taken. I think they made them in South Africa, shipped them to UK, did a load of stuff to them, and then shipped them out to the US.
Yeah.
And then filled them with, thousands of 18650 batteries, the same kind of battery cells as in your laptops, right? But this thing out accelerated, almost anything else at the time.
Yeah.
Was rechargeable in a way that any other prior electric car, could dream of, right? People have been making electric cars, for quite some time. In fact, some of the very earliest cars before the Model T and everything else were electric cars. That was the way before internal combustion was worked out. But you couldn't charge lead acid batteries quick enough, right? And Tesla solved that problem, right? You could get enough energy into the Tesla, and you could build the batteries throughout the frame to make this thing chargeable, in a few hours rather than a few days. And the performance it gave you was great. But that was just the start, right? They've gone on to create some great cars, some practical cars. I think the Cybertruck is going to be interesting. I don't know if we'll see it over here. Not something that I like the design of. And they're going to make a Tesla Semi, that's going to be able to do, 600 or 700 miles range on electric power. But why do I think, that they are, revolutionary, right? I think that some of the joy of driving that we all had in the early days, has gone today from the motorways, the main arteries, the roads that we spend a lot of our time on. But having a car to drive to and from work, and then having a separate car for carving, around corners on weekends, is a luxury, right? And it's not something that people can really enjoy. But that feeling of phenomenal performance, that you can get, is often offset by a car that isn't practical, isn't usable, right? Day to day.
Yeah.
And I think if Tesla get things right, and we'll come on to why in a second, what I think they're starting to do that, they're able to build a car that can take you from your home, in comfort, warmly and safely, onto the motorways, navigate most of the motorways itself, while you get on with something else, or do, take the stress away from jostling for position on the M25, and then get you off onto a decent road, where there's a lot less traffic, and then you can get some incredible performance, right? I mean, I think the Tesla dual motor or tri-motor cars now are doing 0 to 60 in 2 or 3 seconds.
Yeah,
They're
indeed.
doing the quarter miles in under 10, I think, which we
Yeah.
could have only dreamed of a while ago. But they are building faster, cheaper, better cars than almost anyone else can. And they're coming up with hundreds of developments, all the time, that I think other competitors are challenged to compete with. And
Yeah.
that's what I love about what they're doing. And I think they're going to make something soon that could be game changing in terms of performance for the future, massive range, massive performance. And that's pushing the envelope, which I think hopefully will drive everyone forward. I'd love to see fun electric cars that are great fun to drive. And that's where hopefully, the future will bring and deliver on that promise.
Indeed. So, Max, it doesn't surprise me to hear that Tesla is the brand that springs to mind. I mean, I think people listening to this will evidently see two things emerge from your history and your passion around cars. Is one, you're very technology driven, and two, you love going fast in a straight line very quickly. And I think if you sort of combine them, Tesla is the brand that has sort of put the spotlight on those two things as an accessible to all in both high performance, comfort, and technology for the masses, right? Everyone since Tesla arrived on the sort of mainstream has talked about the speed in which you can go in a straight line from 0 to 60 to 100. And of course, now they've got, as you say, much better at being able to extend past 100 miles an hour. And I think it's fair to say that the Tesla has dominated virtually every supercar that used to hold the title of sort of fastest to 60, with some, middle-aged family guy at the wheel just sort of cruising past McLarens and what have you.
Exactly, with his luggage and kids in the back.
Yeah. Exactly right. So it doesn't surprise me. And I think, as a brand, they have reinvented what the industry, I think, was to what it has to become as we go forward into the future. And that is an episode, just for the listeners, I'm going to record with Max and Nige in the coming months, because I think that deserves its own discussion around the technology, what we're doing, where we're going, and so on, and fuels and all of that good stuff. So I want to say a massive thank you, Max. Initially, I thought we'd do probably 45 minutes. It's gone past that, but I've loved every minute of it. I've really enjoyed listening to the history and the passion you have for all the cars that you've owned and worked on and been a part of. So a massive thank you, Max, for your time today.
You're welcome. And it's been great fun out to reminisce and look forward to the future session with Nige as well. All
Excellent.
the best.
Thanks, Max. Take care.
Cheers, buddy. All the best. Bye-bye.